I would maybe suggest that one person, one lucky person, has a chance to ask a question. And since I've been asking questions, and I'm already sort of done asking questions almost, and I think we should continue to discuss later, but maybe one person asked a question. I think we see, do we have a lucky winner? Yes, we do. Okay, there you go.
I'd like to take up your thoughts on the kind of Kantian mode of spectatorship. And I would totally agree that if we are to take Duchamp as contemporary art's immaculate conception, then we'd have to go back to its original sin in Kant to understand its most fundamental logic. So I suppose Kant's idea that reality was that reality can only be correlated to human experience was enacted into art by Duchamp when his art coefficient and the idea that the viewer completes the artwork was taken up by Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, John Cage, and then later Warhol as what became the fundamental logic of contemporary art, which is perhaps that it is open to our interpretation. Unlike modern art, which had an abstract language that Clement Greenberg could attempt to set the terms of production for, contemporary art is entirely for us, for our interpretation. And this seems to interpolate perhaps the same type of subjectivity that is interpolated by neoliberalism, in that both require the viewer, consumer, citizen to be interpolated as what? A liberated, autonomous individual. So it's unsurprising that Jacques Rancière, for example, has become, became contemporary art's favorite philosopher for, championing that sort of, the agency of the spectator, right? So my question is this: how would you imagine art that is not predicated on that mode of a spectatorship that is structured around the viewer's interpretation? Can you imagine an art that is not for us?
Well, I think that I'm surprised in a way to try and save Rancière. I'm surprised. I think he made a mistake by calling his book The Emancipated Spectator. If he had called it The Emancipated User, he might have gone some distance towards, in fact, answering your question. And it wouldn't be implausible for him to entitle that book, if I may say, The Emancipated User, because in many ways, what he's trying to do in saving spectatorship strikes me as not only a dead end, but not easily linked to the type of art production which is emerging around him. And he wanted to save the notion of spectatorship from this idea that it was inherently passive, and he wanted to make it active. But I don't know what, and he talked about spectators as being translators and counter-translators and so on. In other words, in a sense, dealing with an art that was not directed to them, but doing something with it, making use of it for themselves, for their own lives, not being reified subjects the way Guy Debord had described them, because that's who he's targeting, but somehow active in terms of situating themselves symbolically. So I think that, at any rate, if I were to imagine an alternative to the mode of spectatorship, the consumerist, inherently consumerist, and inherently to some extent passive structures of spectatorship, I would frame it around the notion of usership, both in order to imagine that art can have some form of use value, and in fact can only be deprived of it, and has only been deprived of it in a particular historical moment and by particular conceptual edifices. And that it's another way of imagining that art, to take on that notion of usership is also inherently, I think, to break down a division of labor which is increasingly obsolete between production and reception. Usership refers to a far broader category of subjectivity of all those who are stakeholders in the fact that art exists at all. So art is not produced like by the artist and then geared towards the spectator who is like, in the very neoliberalist best tradition is its consumer and its activator and so on. No, in fact, we're within a far more compact notion of usership. So to make a long story short, I would point things in that direction, and I would do it for, as I mentioned just briefly in passing, is that usership also challenges very directly not only spectatorship, but it's also a way of avoiding some of the paradoxes of expert culture, the suffocating dimensions of expert culture, which is always the argument which is made against usership by the experts within the art world, because of course usership is not premised on disinterested interpretation and the general interest, but on particular interest, which is what makes it actually quite interesting, because you don't know what use or misuse or abuse usership will have. And even more fundamentally, and I think this is a fundamental struggle today around the whole notion of a commons and a public domain, is that usership really is the only chance we have to stand up against the privatization of the world and the imposition of the conceptual edifice of ownership everywhere.
Very good. So it's now 2 minutes before the end. I would like to thank all of you for sticking it out and for being here. I would like to thank Stephen for a very, very stimulating and interesting lecture, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of chance to continue afterwards discussing. I'm very sorry that the discussion is so cut short, because it would have been worthwhile to unpack the text some more. And yes, thank you very, very much all for being here. Thank you all the participants and all the users, so to speak.